Oh man, 2019. What an amazing year for movies. Honestly, an amazing end to what was already a fantastic decade for cinema. Even despite some bad movies here and there were so many great movies not to ignore. And you know, with 2019 having so many great movies, it just makes me excited for what 2020 is going to offer with movies. So I am going to look forward to what the movie gods will have to offer in the next coming decade. Well, certainly wasn't what I expected. Now, I know at this point people will most likely just rag about how bad the year was for film, which, as someone who gets very annoyed with people who always tend to reflect upon the year in a very excessively negative way, it's hard to act like 2020 was this magical year where everything was perfect when a lot of stuff happened, and a lot of it was not so good. I'm not going to go on about what exactly happened, because frankly, you guys know by now. You guys know what made this year rough for a lot of people. But I will talk about films of this year, and for movies, it wasn't really that great either. Not so much that every movie that was released this year was bad, but it was more so because it was a year of so many delays and moving around from streaming to theatrical releases due to all the stuff with COVID. Most really promising films to look forward to still haven't come out yet, and other movies have gone straight to streaming to varying degrees of the results. But now, with 2020 being over and everything, I think it's a good time to talk about all the new movies I saw this past year. If this was any other year, I probably just regulated to a best of list, but since I only saw a handful of new movies in 2020 that were new, I figured the better option would be just to rank the movies that came out this year that I've seen and talk at least a little bit about both the good and the bad movies of 2020. Keep in mind there were still a few movies I missed out on this year that won't be talked about on this list.
Oops.
But with it being such an odd year, I think it will be a little bit forgiven. Starting from the absolute worst, working our way to the best. Here is my personal ranking of movies of the year 2020.
All right, that's it. Dishonor on your whole family. Make a note of this.
You know, I thought this list was going to be a little bit smaller because there was one particular movie I did not want to see this year. But being pestered by so many others in regards to this movie, I was unfortunately forced to watch this garbage, which just so happens to be... At this point, I think the Disney remakes have officially proven themselves to be the lowest form of cinema. They're not only cringe, but they are the laziest and most uninspired films that had this much money behind them due to how they just take what was already great about some of the best animated films of all time and suck it all out. But that's okay, cause we're live action and we're so much mature and better than those golden cartoons made for babies, and we have piss jokes and shit jokes and CGI garbage, and we plan on inspired acting.
Yes.
Sooner or later, these movies have to stop, and I encourage anyone to please stop seeing them. But on to Mulan 2020, because this movie can be described as one thing.
Boring.
This movie feels so directionless, with Mulan just being this blank slate with no real development. Even though the original movie was about her proving herself to be a strong warrior, this dumpster fire just makes her this character with no flaws or passions. She's just destined to win no matter what. Not only does this contradict the original movie, but the remake has very little moments that really stand out or had any emotions when it comes to the characters and story. But does that make it the absolute worst Disney remake? If I'm being a little bit honest, not quite. Mainly because, well, there's a couple of things that aren't 100% awful about this movie. The cinematography and the score are still kinda decent in a way. I mean, granted, the presentation still suffers from horrible editing that ruins any decent shots, and there's some really questionable CGI at points, but thankfully it's not as persistent as other Disney remakes. And you know, I'll give Mulan this. I am at least glad this movie isn't just a copy-paste version of the original film like the past 3 Disney remakes of the 90s movies. Like, the fact this movie doesn't have songs from the original, I'm okay with for the most part, since it does help make this movie stand out a little bit from the original. It is something that I wished more Disney remakes could do, just retell the story and do it differently with some elements from the Disney movie here and there. But this is still just a really poor retelling of the Mulan tale. Even if it does feel like a different movie, it doesn't make up for the fact that it still feels on the level of quality of something like Maleficent, and maybe even worse than that, because it's so boring and bland with nothing special about it. It doesn't capture why the original animated film was so beloved to begin with. Plus, with that in mind, it makes this movie a lot worse, because honestly, this could have been the exception to the rule in terms of Disney remakes, since it legitimately looked kind of promising at first with it not being a recreation of the original movie, and hell, even with this movie being geared more towards older audience, maybe it could have been something special. But no, it's just a drag of a movie that proves that Disney remakes cannot be saved. Mulan 2020 may not be the bottom of the barrel of Disney remakes, but quite frankly, it is a struggle to sit through, and I can't recommend this movie in the slightest. And at this point, I don't want to see a new live-action Disney remake ever again. And let's make sure of it next time. So if they release another garbage fest like this for $30 on Disney Plus, just save your money. Please, save your money. And please, if we get to a point where a certain animated Disney classic is remade, no one should dare force me to see this garbage, because it'll be an absolute sin to humanity that we failed, and I don't want to be a part of seeing these garbage remakes ever again after this. So let's get to the next movie on our list before I get even madder about this.
It's a monster! Kill it! Kill it!
So with theaters being very uncertain for the time being, I did something this year that I've always wanted to do, but never had a good opportunity to do so. That is going to the drive-in, which is a pretty neat experience seeing a movie there, and I'm glad I was finally able to do that, especially as someone who's always loved the theater experience, but couldn't really do it this year due to obvious reasons. And it's a very unique way to see movies. Even though most of the movies I saw at the drive-in were older releases like the SpongeBob movie and Toy Story, there were still at least 3 movies I saw at the drive-in that were brand new. One of them being Monster Hunter, and it was really bad. Full disclosure, I have not played any of the Monster Hunter games, nor have I watched any of the Resident Evil movies. However, even with that in mind, this was exactly what I expected. This is one of those video game movies that was dumped out, that feels like a movie that came out in 2008. This starts out as one of those generic action movies that has a weird obsession with military that I thought we were past in the 2020s, and I may not have played the games, but even I know this series is more of an epic fantasy as opposed to generic sci-fi military action. Even if you separate it as an adaptation, it really doesn't work, because characters are introduced as the most one-dimensional military stereotypes with some of the most standard dialogue you can think of, and they're also quickly disregarded with not a reason established to why we should care about their journey. There are a few moments where Mila Jovovich and Tony Jaa work off each other well, but those moments are few and far between. It could have been a cool movie that managed to do some world building, introducing the world of Monster Hunter to a larger audience, but they're more reliant on making this movie a dumb, explosion-filled action fest. A good example of how this movie poorly builds on the Monster Hunter franchise is that there's this cat creature that randomly shows up that's from the game, which he's a cool design and honestly the highlight of the movie, but he comes in so late into the film that Monster Hunter fans will feel cheated out on this movie utilizing the property well, and people who haven't played the game will see this as this bizarre character that comes out of nowhere. I know some people who enjoy the Resident Evil movies being dumb action movies, and I would say I could see this movie being enjoyed in that way, but the action is so poorly lit that you can barely tell what's going on, and even when it isn't, it's just the same type of CGI crap you've seen done better in other movies. It's not really worth it. It didn't piss me off as much as the Mulan remake did, as I don't really have a strong attachment to this series, and it was exactly what I expected it to be, so I wasn't really disappointed, but I still don't recommend this movie at all. Whether you play the games or not, you're better off experiencing them than this garbage.
Oops.
He's loose!
Another movie I ended up seeing at the drive-in was DreamWorks' The Croods 2, and it was not that good. Starting off, it is kind of weird that this movie exists, mainly because it's a sequel to a movie that didn't really have a huge impact on pop culture. Just kind of came out of the blue after such a long gap between the first, and came out during the pandemic of all things. Though if I'm being honest, the first Croods actually isn't really that bad of a movie. It's not one of the very best of DreamWorks, but it's cute, and it has a good sense of adventure and has some pretty solid animation with great backgrounds and creature design. The sequel doesn't really feel like a proper follow-up and instead aims for comedic value. It has a lot more pop songs and it's a little bit more obnoxious, and it just doesn't have that same sense of adventure and wonder the first movie had to offer. Most of the movie just deals with them hanging out with this new family as this luxury place, and they just more or less stick around there without a huge conflict outside of the typical new family sees them as bad because they don't live the same lifestyle as they do, and of course they have to eventually come together. It would be more exciting if they went on some sort of journey, but they don't really have any big conflict till like the third act. Even then, it's just regulated to a ton of gags that aren't really that funny and nothing really impactful for these characters. There are some alright aspects of this movie. There are a few gags here and there that are pretty funny, and even has some decent morals, with one of the characters having a realization that their words can be more impactful than they initially think, which was actually kind of a nice change of pace, and the animation is fairly decent. It is odd because it goes for a more cartoony vibe than the first movie, which is another aspect that makes this movie not as good as the first animation wise, but it still retains some of the decent design elements that the first movie had to offer, with some really cool design here and there. Though again, it's lacking because there's not much of that, since this movie isn't a big adventure like the first movie. It's a shame really, because DreamWorks can do really well with given the right material, and this movie just feels like an obligation. Plus, given the fact that it was released in theaters during the worst possible time financially, it's clear that DreamWorks didn't really have faith in this movie either. Bottom line, just stick with the first movie.
Go ahead, Mr. K. I'm making a complete what of myself?
The third SpongeBob movie, otherwise known as Sponge on the Run, was honestly disappointing in my view. This movie is far from awful, but as the third and supposedly final SpongeBob movie, it felt pretty lacking, which is a shame because there are a lot of really neat things that do work about this movie, as one featuring everyone's favorite Sponge. Of course, the voice acting and characterizations are decent, to be expected, but the real highlight of this movie is the animation. While it's not 2D animation this time around, this movie still managed to look fantastic, giving a more stylized CGI look that looks more like a stop-motion animated feature and looks a hell of a lot better than the other CGI SpongeBob show they're doing. Not just due to the limited movement, but even the character models had sort of a stop-motion appearance to them. Like, Plankton looks like he's almost claymation in a sense. It definitely helped make the movie more enjoyable. However, the rest of it just feels pretty mediocre. I'm fine with this movie being fun primarily, but the gags aren't really that special, and even the story itself is just a standard road trip with nothing that goes further as a SpongeBob movie. This doesn't have the grand finality to it as the original movie did, nor does it go really bizarre and out there like the second movie did. It's arguably more consistent in terms of plot than the second movie, which suffer from having a plot that has too many recycled plot points from other SpongeBob episodes. But at least Sponge Out of Water got really out there in terms of its like surrealness and visuals. This one doesn't, and when it tries to be odd with its live action segments, they come across as really trendy and oddly out of place. Though the movie's real issue comes from the last act, which I won't reveal too much since the release cycle for this movie is kinda odd. But let's just say, if you saw the element of Camp Coral in the trailer for this movie, you know exactly where it goes when it actually gets to that point, and honestly, it becomes kinda lame. I get that it's a way to set up a certain plot aspect of how SpongeBob impacted the lives of others, but they really could have done it in a way that didn't feel like an advertisement for the new show. Technically, this movie still doesn't have a US release, since Viacom has been very weird about this movie's release, as it's on Netflix in other countries, but not in the US. So I ended up watching it through ExpressVPN to get to it. If you do have an interest in this movie, I would say it's maybe worth seeing once if you're a SpongeBob fan, but I don't recommend rushing out to see it either.
You really think someone would do that? Just go on the internet and tell lies?
Documentaries are something that I don't always go out of my way to see all the time, but if it's recommended to me or if it's a topic that I'm interested in, I'll definitely give it a watch. In the case of The Social Dilemma, I was recommended this movie by my uncle, and I could see why. This is a movie that discusses a lot about how social media can be manipulated and how negative it can be on our society. For the most part, I feel this film is very important in a lot of ways, especially in an age where social media is so prevalent in our culture and how some people can get the wrong information. So if this movie has such an important message, why is it so low on this list? Well, because there are two parts of this movie. The first part is the part that I like, which is being a full-fledged documentary that has well-constructed interviews and research. But there's the other part that tries to be an actual fictional narrative that represents what they're talking about, and this movie really should have just have stick with being a documentary. The way they have these scripted narrative moments come across as too preachy. When you have actual serious real world issues they're talking about going on right now, and then cut to a scene like this, yeah, it comes across as pretty corny. Honestly, without these scenes, I think you have a very informative and gripping documentary, and especially by the end where they have this very poignant line about social media, and it's a good note to end the film on too. But when you have corny, borderline propaganda stuff like this, it just kind of drags the film down. Despite that, I still recommend this movie. As I said, it's still an important watch. I just think it would have been more powerful without this narrative structure that they tried to do with this movie. So let's move on then.
I wished I could go to the wild.
The Call of the Wild was one of those movies I actually ended up seeing in theaters this year. And it goes in a very specific category of movie for me, as in there is one term I can describe this movie as, and that term is... it's fine. Yeah, Call of the Wild is a movie I'm perfectly comfortable saying that it's fine. It's a movie that I don't find anything particularly remarkable about it, but at the same time, I think it's also a very inoffensive movie that I think is serviceable for the kind of movie it strives to be. It's a big adventure movie with Harrison Ford and a CGI dog, and it works okay for the most part. I know some people complain about how the dog is CGI, and yeah, it is distracting, but I don't think the CGI is that bad, and the dog still manages to be at least a very expressive character. And Harrison Ford does a pretty solid job as the dog's main partner. The downside is that this movie doesn't really excel much further than it being a simple adventure film. There's nothing really deep about it than that. I know some who read the original book stated that the original story goes darker, and this movie doesn't go all the way. And I haven't read the book because I'm an uncultured swine, though I could see this movie being potentially better if it went all out with a CG or all out live action with a real dog instead of a hybrid. But for what it's worth, it's entertaining. There's nothing about it I would consider cringe or done horribly. There's not really a whole lot I have to say except it's alright. Next movie.
There's no place like I want to be a witch.
This is another movie I have similar to say about Call of the Wild, in the sense that I think it's just fine. I do have a little bit more to say about The Witches though, because I just recently watched the original film for the first time this year. The original Witches is a lot of fun with some awesome special effects for the time and managed to be a really creepy kids film in the best kind of way. And ironically enough, the day after I watched the original movie, they announced the remake is coming to HBO Max. And the remake is okay. It doesn't have the same rad special effects of the original and feels like a weaker movie overall. Yet I oddly enjoyed myself watching this film for how odd and weird it is. Some of the choices they made are a bit too weird, especially the film's ending, which I won't reveal, but compared to the original movie, it didn't really work for me as well. Though apparently it is more faithful to the book's original ending from what I heard. It can get ridiculous, and the CGI doesn't have the same charm of the awesome makeup and puppetry the original film had to offer. It still has some redeeming elements though, as Octavia Spencer is great as the mother figure here, and Anne Hathaway is entertaining. I can't tell if she's giving a good performance or if she's bad, but at least she looks like she's having a lot of fun in this role. This is another one I don't have much to say other than it's just okay, but you're better off seeing the original movie if you ask me.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I hate that hedgehog.
I am honestly amazed at this movie in the grand scheme of things, being that this movie came out in 2020. This movie was not only delayed, but delayed due to production, well, with this
Meow?
being the thing that made people want this movie to change, and it went from being a 2019 film to being delayed to 2020 just a month before the pandemic happened. As we all know, that ended up making pretty much every other movie to be delayed in some capacity. And I have to say, that's pretty amazing considering that this hedgehog not only managed to get out of being in a movie that's in the quality of a Disney remake, but also managed to escape from being in 2020's cycle of delayed movies. That's really impressive. However, despite that, does that make Sonic the Hedgehog 2020 a good movie and a good adaptation of the character? Well, let me just say this. This is coming from a die-hard fan of the series. Not only someone who has grown up and played nearly every game in the series, but even this year, I did a huge playthrough of every major Sonic game. Yes, even this one. So, as a Sonic expert, well, it's okay. I say this because ultimately, again, I think this movie is just fine. It managed to be a decent film that's more so a good film for kids than anything else. It does have some cheap humor and weak jokes that don't stand out all that well, yet the movie managed to have a decent amount of charm to it. It is partially due to how great the redesign is, and in the long run, it was definitely a great decision on the filmmaker's part, even despite the last minute changes. I'm glad they got extra time to work on this too, because this movie is proof that sometimes you don't need weird, realistic designs to be successful. However, the movie itself still kinda is the type of movie we thought it would be, with it being a cartoony character in the real world interacting with some dude. Though it still gets a bit of a pass from me, mainly because characterization-wise, Sonic is nailed pretty well, not just in design, but the snarky attitude that we're used to seeing from him is still intact, and Ben Schwartz does a great job voicing him. Plus, Jim Carrey as Robotnik was pretty much everything I hope he was going to be, and I'm glad he exists as this character.
Are you in charge here? Yes.
No.
The promise of what has been shown in this movie makes me hope that the sequel will improve further and be more of what I think a Sonic movie should be. And hey, with them not having the rushed production this time around, and also the for sure inclusion of Tails, I think Sonic 2 could be a vast improvement, hopefully. But until then, this movie serves as a decent introduction to the character in the film world. Maybe not the movie that Sonic 100% deserves, but I'm thankful that this movie still at least managed to be decent, and we got it to be that as opposed to what we could have gotten initially.
Am I glad he's frozen in there and that we're out here and that he's the sheriff and that we're frozen out here and that we're in there, and I just remembered.
I know Scoop has been very, very mixed among fans and audiences, but I honestly felt this movie was kind of fun. Not great, but pretty enjoyable for a number of different reasons. I know a lot were disappointed in the fact that this movie didn't really have the typical Scooby Doo formula for being the first big CGI movie with him, and it tried to be more of a Hanna-Barbera crossover instead. But that aspect I did not mind, namely because, for one thing, it's Scooby Doo, one of the most formulaic franchises in existence. So I think we can afford a movie that does something a bit different. And second, I think it's kind of neat for them to bring attention to a lot of these classic Hanna-Barbera characters. So the issue with the film is that it never really goes that far with its crossover, when they could have gotten more characters or do something that's a bit more refreshing than it it just being a superhero movie. Some jokes are fun, other jokes don't work all that well. So it's kind of a hit or miss comedy-wise. Animation-wise, I like the designs for the most part, and it does go for a more cartoony route, which is welcome. But it does look a little bit cheaper than other anime movies at this point, with some characters looking a little bit flat and some backgrounds just looking pretty standard. Yet, I still don't find this movie to be a disaster, and for whatever reason, some people found this to be very odd and bizarre, which I don't see. Like, whoa, it's so weird that all these Hanna-Barbera characters are here, and why is Simon Cowell here? Again, it's Scooby Doo. This isn't the first time they interacted with Hanna-Barbera characters, and this isn't even the first time they had dated celebrity cameos.
Like Urkel.
But it can get bland at points, and I wish they did more with the rest of the mystery gang, as they don't really get that much time dedicated to them outside of Shaggy and Scooby, which is pretty disappointing. But I absolutely love Dick Dastardly as a villain. Not only is he a faithful version of the original character, but he has the best jokes and lines here. His whole backstory with Muttley is probably the funniest moment in the film for me, and I think he's easily the highlight of the whole entire experience of watching Scoob.
Okay, Rick.
No, I'm not a Rick. I'm a Dick with a D.
Rick with a D.
So yeah, it's flawed and could have been better as a new CGI animated Scooby Doo film, but I found it enjoyable for what it was. Not one I highly recommend, but if you're interested and don't mind Scooby Doo taking a more Hanna-Barbera crossover approach, I think you might find some enjoyment from this.
Life is good, but it can be better.
Wonder Woman 1984 was another movie from the summer I was personally really excited for. Being a huge DC fan and also in love with the first Wonder Woman movie, of course I definitely had high interest for the sequel coming up. But much like with so many other movies this year, it got striked with delays to the point where it ended up being released on Christmas in both theaters and HBO Max. All during the first time in years where Marvel did not release a single movie. So, like it or not, this holds as one of the best comic book movies of the year by default. However, Wonder Woman 1984 was in quite a few ways a little disappointing for me compared to the first movie. It's by no means bad, and I'm not sure how people are saying this is the worst DC movie when there are aspects of this movie that work very well actually. Starting with the good, the tone and direction of this movie is actually really nice to see in a modern day comic book movie. This is a movie that definitely strives for camp value, and I am totally down with this movie going in that direction because it executes this campy tone fairly well. Patty Jenkins clearly made a movie that was heavily inspired by Richard Donner's Superman and the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies, which as a sequel to Wonder Woman, yeah, that's not a bad approach to take this movie at all. It can get a little corny, but I feel like it was more or less intentional here, as Jenkins gives this movie the look and feel of a classic superhero movie. The first 30 minutes are easily the best part, with the Olympic Games set piece and all the moments in the beginning where we just see Diana saving random people. Really helps set up this movie's heroic nature very well. Also, Pedro Pascal is a lot of fun to watch as Maxwell Lord here, being a cheesy yet kind of fun villain that really fits into this campy movie's style. Where the movie falls apart as a sequel is in its script. The fun, over-the-top campy nature this movie tries to strive for is fine, honestly. However, this script still could have benefited from a few extra rewrites or two, because this is a movie that relies heavily on comic book movie logic, with a lot of stuff happening in this movie that feel very extravagant. It's fine for this kind of movie given the nature and tone it's setting up against. Where this movie loses me is that it kind of crosses that line of suspension of disbelief, and this is mainly due to the fact that some of the set pieces just aren't as exciting from an emotional or character level, at least compared to the first movie for me, since there's no scene that's not even close on the level of No Man's Land in terms of character growth for Diana herself here. Yet more so than that, this movie feels a bit rushed in a few areas, namely with Steve Trevor and Cheetah. I like Chris Pine, and he does a fine job here, but watching this movie, I can't help but feel that his character did not need to be here. Sure, they have an explanation for why he's here, but it still relies on comic book movie logic, and all the scenes with him and Diana didn't really need to be here when his character's whole story arc was completed fairly well in the first movie and ended off with really good closure. It mainly bothers me because they really could have used some of that time with Steve Trevor to set up Cheetah better as a villain. She starts out as someone kind of promising at first as they set up this whole dynamic between her and Diana. However, it never goes anywhere. It should have been a story where Diana and Barbara team up in the same way Steve and her did in the first movie, because as it is now, Barbara's introduced, gets power, suddenly becomes evil at the last minute, only to become a Jellicle cat. But even despite my issues with this movie from a script perspective, I don't think it's that bad. Just has a lot of missed opportunities. It has an energy and personality to it that makes it fun, and as far as female empowerment movies, it's leagues ahead over Mulan. But there was one DC movie this year that I felt did a much better job at being a female empowerment movie than 1984. But we'll get to that one a little bit later. Bottom line, the movie is alright as a whole. But to end it on a quote from the movie itself,
But it can be better.
yeah, what Mando said.
It's very amusing, Invisible Man. Hello, great to see you.
The Invisible Man was actually something I missed out on in theaters, as this movie wasn't really on the high end of my list to watch when it comes to films of 2020, and it didn't help that it came out right as the pandemic started. But as a whole, it's a pretty solid horror remake, namely because unlike every other attempt at a dark universe movie that Universal strives to do, this managed to be an actual, well, horror movie. Universal monsters starring in a horror movie? Yeah, who would have thought that would work out well? So this is definitely the best attempt at a revival of a classic Universal monster movie character. As far as it being a movie itself, it's solid, it's well directed, acted, and while it gets a little cheesy, it does manage to take this rather silly concept and executed fairly well. The special effects are very well done with how you can make this Invisible Man actually a threat. Plus, the movie doesn't rely excessively on jump scares either. I will say, of directors Lee Wernall's work so far, I definitely prefer his first debut film, Upgrade, since that was a little bit more original and had a little bit more of a concise story to it. But even then, I think this is a good second movie from him, and I look forward to his next project. I don't really have much else to say, except I'll end with this little fun fact. Did you know there was an episode of Batman the Animated Series that also starred Elizabeth Moss as someone who interacts with an invisible man? I don't know about you guys, but I find that to be a pretty cool coincidence.